This unusual holiday season is for many of us filled with such mixed emotions, missing loved ones and beloved traditions, and also perhaps some relief at not having the beloved traditions or spending time with difficult relatives. And so really this Christmas can be a season to reinvent the festivities. Because reinvention is actually part of the Christmas tradition. And we should know because in the 19th century, Unitarians helped to create the Christmas we know today. This Christmas of families and presents and Santa, that was us. New England Unitarians helped shape this holiday of commerce and consumption. So much so that it could be said that the Christmas we celebrate today is a Unitarian Universalist tradition. Christmas has never, in its long history, simply been about the birth of the Christian Savior. This celebration at the darkest time of the year was built on far more ancient rituals. Before the rise of Christianity, that longest night, winter solstice, here in northern countries, was a time of ritual and feasting and visiting and merrymaking. Evergreens were brought inside during the early winter in many cultures, sometimes signifying everlasting life, sometimes to honor a god. And when the Christian church in the 4th century decided to formally celebrate the birth of Christ, choosing December 25th, part of it was a conscious decision to piggyback on those festivities already in place around winter solstice and a Roman holiday known as Saturnalia. And in fact, it wasn't until the 9th century that Christ's Mass became a formal holy day within the Catholic tradition. Now, by medieval times, over the centuries, the 12 days of Christmas from December 25th to January 6th became a break at the end of a busy agricultural year, and it became a time of rest and revelry. Farmers and workers would call upon local gentry, and they would serve the best food and drink they had. It was an offering, a once-a-year offering to those who did the work that the gentry depended on. And in some ways, it was a yearly safety valve, a reversal of the social class system, the day in which the rich catered to the poor. And it was a feast for all for the worst of the winter and the frugal use of food stores. And so that was a real pleasure at that time. And so for most of Europe, Christmas was more of a time of partying than a sacred celebration. And then came the Protestant Reformations, and efforts were made to return Christmas to that simple recognition of Christ, to a simply church service, and large-scale gatherings were seen as sort of frivolous in piety. And so by the time European settlers landed in North America, December 25th, sometimes for some was a day of green and festivities, for others it wasn't. Catherine Parr Traill, who wrote about her life as a pioneer near Peterborough in the 1830s, wrote that she was surprised at the cold indifference people had towards Christmas. Church was scantily attended, and people did not dress their houses in evergreens. And what she found was that New Year's Day for early Canadians was the day of days for a party. That was the day that was the true festivities. And in our neighbors to the south in the US, the legacy of the Puritans meant that the celebration of Christmas was muted. It had actually been banned completely for several years. And so in New England, it was largely just another day shops and businesses were open. But as we moved into the 19th century, that began to change. The United States became more prosperous. There was a growing middle class, and people had a little bit more to play with. And so Christmas went back to becoming the street festival, a time of public excess. Christmas songs were bawdy, dancing, and drinking prevailed. And it was another sort of brief period of wild abandon for laborers. And in fact, in cities, that social nature of Christmas revelry was, in the minds of this emerging middle class, threatening public safety because people were partying in the streets, and newspapers were filled with concerns about reports of fighting and arrests. And so our well-off Unitarian ancestors wanted to kind of have a different kind of observance of Christmas, and that began sort of in the 1820s for moving forward. Unitarians thought that it was important to celebrate Christmas in a way that focused on the family, on private gatherings gathered around that Christmas tree. And so by working quite intentionally to bring Christmas into the family sphere, Unitarians helped to move it from a street festival to a domestic ritual. That old tradition of gifts of food and drink given by the rich to the poor was evolved into this exchange of gifts by family members. Because as a family, you already shared food and drink, gifts became either things you made for one another or commercial purchases. The now familiar Christmas presents of toys and books and games and more. And so New England Unitarian writers like Harriet Martineau published articles in Unitarian magazines, they wrote popular books, and they contributed to this literary depiction of the family Christmas with Christmas trees and presents, influencing social attitudes and expectations. And it's no surprise that merchants quickly took to this concept of Christmas. It got the rowdy people off the streets that might do damage to their stores, and it brought new business opportunities. And by the 1830s, Christmas advertising was commonplace. Christmas cards became into vogue. And there are stories written by the 1850s of people complaining about buying too many things for people who already had too much stuff. That was happening in 1850. And so Christmas, as we know it, had arrived. And I'm not sure whether to applaud our Unitarian ancestors or condemn them. I love the Christmas tree in my front room and the mysterious packages underneath and the mince pies and gingerbread. But I also know all the issues around commercialism and consumption, and that image of a perfect family having perfect Christmas has caused a lot of heartache for those of us, for all of us who have imperfect families and imperfect Christmases. Fortunately, we can make a Christmas what we will. It has been reinvented before as our Unitarian ancestors did so, and it can be reinvented again. And we're going to take a break now and sing another carol written by a Unitarian. And this is from the Reverend Edmund Hamilton Sears. And it is the very well-known and beloved "It Came Upon a Midnight Clear." And this was written in 1849. And it was probably in response to the Mexican-American War that was happening, because Sears was an ardent pacifist. And you'll notice that neither this carol nor the first one, Bells on Christmas Day, mentions the birth of Jesus. Instead, they're carols about the spirit of the season, that desire for peace on earth and goodwill to all. Now, in fairness to our ancestors, New England Unitarians were not trying to create a Christmas of commercialism. They actually had a greater vision of Christmas as a time of generosity and service. They were seeking to embody their beliefs, to live their values, that sense of neighborly love. And so for them, Christmas was this time to raise awareness of issues around poverty, because there were no social safety nets at that time, and just take that direct action to help their neighbors. And exchanging gifts was a way to instill a sense of generosity and service in children. Prior to the 1800s, children might receive little gifts or treats at Christmas, but they didn't give them. And that family exchange meant that children were taught to save their pennies, practice crafts, and give to others. They were encouraged to share their good fortune with those who had less. And many of you may be familiar with Little Women. Louisa May Alcott was a Unitarian, and the four girls give their Christmas feast away to a family that is in dire straits. And that was really, that exemplifies what Unitarians were trying to instill in the culture of the time. They wanted their children to develop a sense of generosity, that awareness of the needs of others, and a desire to help the impoverished. They wanted their children to understand they had the power to change lives for the better. And the carols we've been singing today point to that vision of this season of light, the desire for peace, for goodwill to all people, to hopes for a new day of equality and love. And I think this is the meaning of Christmas we all still aspire to in some way: generosity, peace, and goodwill. We continue to wish our children to open their hearts to others, to understand their power to help. It's why when we're together, we host Pancake Sunday at the beginning of December and have our annual mitten tree. And we wish this by ourselves, to have our hearts opened, to remind ourselves that we have the power to change the world. We still all seek to be our better selves. And it's one of the reasons why A Christmas Carol by English author Charles Dickens also endures. Dickens was already a popular author by the time he wrote this novella about Ebenezer Scrooge and the visits of the three spirits of Christmas. And it's a story of his transformation from a bitter miser to a happy and generous man. Scrooge learnt that Unitarian lesson to be generous and help his fellow passengers on the journey of life. Now, Dickens wrote this story in 1843, and in 1842, he had spent several months in America, and a lot of that time was in New England, where Dickens was very impressed by the prominent Unitarian thinkers, that was the people he was hanging out with there. And he actually returned to England and spent several years as part of a London Unitarian congregation. He also had Unitarian friends up in the growing city of Manchester. And when he visited them, he was really disturbed by the impact of industrialization on the working poor. They lived in terrible conditions. And so because he was already a popular author, he was moved by the plight of the impoverished, and he started to work on a strongly worded pamphlet to call attention to this situation. But over the year of 1843, he came to realize that a fable would send a message with 20,000 times the force of a pamphlet. And in just 6 weeks, he wrote A Christmas Carol. And like the Unitarian carols you heard, the festive season in the book is depicted about being far more than the birth of Jesus Christ. In fact, Jesus is barely mentioned in this tale of charity and human connection. For Dickens, like our Unitarian ancestors, Christmas is about the generosity of spirit, kindness, caring for others. It's a time for each of us to choose to be a beacon of hope. So Dickens talked about that kinship, brought up that kinship with the traditional British feasts of plenty, encouraging Scrooge to break free of his misery and miserliness. Through those pleasures of food and drink and merriment, those are paths to a generous heart, as you can see in the character of Fezziwig. And then through Bob Cratchit and his family, Dickens celebrates the beauty of family togetherness, of caring for one another. And Scrooge sees that time with loved ones is just as precious as the feast. So A Christmas Carol demonstrates that Unitarian faith in humanity, that we have the power within ourselves to help one another. Scrooge's character is transformed, but it's when he acts on that transformation that he is truly renewed. It's about behavior, not just beliefs. And the tale challenges the notion common at that time that poverty was a divine punishment, or that your social class is just what you were born into and there was nothing that could be done about it. You were born poor, you die poor. Instead, Dickens points out that the ignorance and want of poverty is caused by a failure of society, the failure specifically of people to care, because poverty can be ended by better wages and social reforms, by those in charge, those with wealth, changing their ways. And so Charles Dickens helped create that Unitarian sense of Christmas traditions of charity and compassion, writing them larger onto this stage of social reform. And although now they're very traditional parts of Christmas, they were radical in the day. This was not the common way of doing Christmas. Unitarians helped to expand Christmas into this larger season of light, not just a moment of good cheer, but that expression of an ardent desire that all people be well, that the hungry will be fed, that the lonely will be cherished, that the hurting will be healed, that peace will prevail. And these are still hopes worth cherishing, visions worth working towards. And they're bigger now than Christmas. Each of us can make of Christmas what we will. It can be a time of family festivities or a day of sacred contemplation. And we as people of the Chalice will continue to work throughout the year for a world without poverty. So however you celebrate this odd holiday season of this year, whether it's Zoom parties with family or movie binging or just a good meal, however you celebrate, may it feed your body and your soul. Let this be a season that brings joy to your heart, goodwill to all, and more peace into the world. So say we all.